We're all going to have times where we think we should go our own way, but God decides differently. So we make these grand plans, or we have this career picked out that we're going to have, and then something changes and it doesn't work out the way we thought. I've had probably 15 to 20 different career changes as far as what I wanted to do since I've been a kid, and none of them was youth pastor. So God changed my mind. I wanted to be a professional soccer player, but I was too fat. I wanted to be a football player, but my mom wouldn't let me play. Wanted to be a musician, but that didn't happen. Wanted to be a history professor, that didn't happen. And then I ended up here because this is what God had planned for me. And some of you have probably already changed your mind on what you wanted to do when you become an adult. Has anybody changed your mind? Just show of hands. Brad, I think you're long past becoming an adult, man. But we all have these big ideas of what we want to do with our lives, and then God kind of changes that and molds us into who He wants us to be if we're being obedient, and then we become the thing that He wants us to be, again, if we're obedient. But these things happen, and it doesn't work out the way we think they should. So tonight we're going to be looking at Paul. We are finishing up the book of Acts. We've been in here about a year. We're in chapter 27 and 28, and we're going to be looking at a couple of detours that Paul had to go through on his way from Cilicia all the way to Rome. Now, we know that his main plan was to end up in Rome, and so that's this journey that he's going on tonight. But his goal was to stand before Caesar. At this time was a man named Nero, and to proclaim the gospel to him. And what I'm doing is I'm going to give you a little bit of information about Nero so you understand how just important this is. So he was also known as Claudius Caesar Augustus, if you get in your history classes. Now think about this. Think of your worst enemy, if you have one, or someone that just hates your guts. Would you go up to them and talk to them about Jesus? Would you risk your life to build a relationship with them so they would come to know Christ? Probably not. Most of us tend to avoid people that we don't like. We tend to avoid people that disagree with us. But this is exactly who Paul is going to meet. He's going to meet this Caesar who hates Christianity, who blamed Christianity for things that he did. So let me tell you what worldhistory.org says. It says that Nero may have murdered his father to take control of the empire. He was extremely self-centered, forcing people to stay at his horrible concerts where he couldn't sing. He was very into himself. He would have these concerts where he would sing and he would play his lyre, and people were literally like, women were giving birth in the crowd and they were not allowed to leave. And there were men that were falling asleep. They were sitting on the wall. They fell asleep and they fell off the wall and died. And they moved their bodies after the concert was over because they could not leave. It gets worse. He had his own mother stabbed to death. He had his first wife murdered so he could marry another woman. In his second marriage, he got in an argument with his pregnant wife, kicked her in the stomach, and killed her and her child. So this guy was horrible. Let's see what else he did. He then is attributed by many historians as setting the city of Rome on fire and blaming Christians because he basically wanted to remap it and change it into what he wanted it to be. And so he caused a widespread panic, killing many of his own people, destroying, I think, 11 of the 14 provinces in Rome, and then blamed it on Christians, which led to just horrible persecution of Christians. And then Paul appeals 2 years after this great fire. So 2 years after this persecution has been at its height, he's like, I want to talk to Caesar. And so instead of going to trial with Festus and these other men, he said, no, take me to Caesar. And he uses his Roman citizenship to go and to have the opportunity to talk to Caesar. Many first century Christians believed that Nero was the Antichrist. That's how bad this man was. They believed that he was the one that was going to lead the end of the world and Christ was going to come back and Revelation was going to be fulfilled. And they believed it was because of Nero. And so this is who Paul felt led by God to share the gospel with. From the time he appealed to Caesar until the time he actually had the opportunity to do it was a little over 2 years. And Paul dealt with a few different detours on the way. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So let me ask this question. What do we do with detours? We're looking at Acts 27 and 28. Let me show you this picture on the screen. Can you guys see that? So what's going on is he started out here, and it's got words on here that you can look at later, but he starts here, he goes north, travels east, or travels west, gets shipwrecked over here, ends up on an island, and then finally gets up there. This trip took him a little over a year to do, and according to several different historians, it should have only taken about 5 months. Because there were constant problems and constant things that had to go on. So in the first 12 verses, when detours come, we need to listen to godly people. This is not what happened with the people that are on the ship, but this is what we need to do. So in the first 12 verses, we see the first detour. The men wanted to do one thing, but God changed their course. So in the first 8 verses, we see something really important. First of all, we see Julius the centurion is introduced. So this is the guy who is over all the prisoners. There's over 200 prisoners on the ship. There's 276 men, I think, total on the ship. And he has a friendship or something, or he's at least kind to Paul. And so there's instances to where Paul's allowed to do certain things that other men are not. And towards the end of the chapter, he actually starts listening to Paul and his advice. But this is good for Paul because it allows him to be treated favorably. Second, Luke, who was writing Acts, is present with Paul in the situation. So Luke is also a prisoner for Christ at this very moment because he's writing alongside him. And it also tells us that Aristarchus from Thessalonica, if you remember from Acts chapter 19, he was one of the men that was dragged into the theater, him and Gaius, whenever they were about to be killed by the people, when the uprising happened in Ephesus. And so he was a prisoner with them as well. So he stuck with them through all of that. And then third, the sailing conditions were not very good. So they faced hardship because of the weather, the time of year, and the ship they were on was not capable of completing the journey. So they ended up changing to a larger ship to try to finish the journey. But that didn't work either. So we see some warning signs in verses 1 through 12. When you read these verses, you see words like difficult, slow, against us, sheltered, struggled, dangerous. Doesn't that stuff sound good? No, it's describing the weather. It's describing the conditions that they're about to sail in, that they have been sailing in, and yet these men are continually trying to push through. So what this is doing is this is giving us an idea of what's about to happen. It's setting the stage for what's coming. So God's setting them up for this detour. He's about to change their course to accomplish something even greater. So the weather was against them, but they were fighting it because they were confident in themselves. They felt like they knew better than God. They felt like they knew what they were doing. So you ever get a gut feeling about something? I don't exactly, is that like intuition or something we call it? Discernment is the Christian word for it. But we get discernment, or we get this gut feeling that we know something bad's going to happen, right? These guys didn't have that. They were clueless. They were like, we're just going to go about our own merry way. We think we know better, so we're just going to keep going into it. They were trusting in their own abilities more than they should have. Our abilities can only get us so far. And if God is not present with us, more than likely it's not going to work out to your advantage. Most of the time it's going to get you in more trouble than it should. In verse 10, we see that Paul finally speaks up. So in the first 9 verses, he keeps quiet, but in 10 he says, look, he tells the ship's officers, men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. So he's warning them and saying, look, if we continue on this journey, we are going to lose everything, including our lives. The ship is going to be gone. The prisoners are going to be dead. The centurion is going to be dead. The officers are going to be dead. We are going to lose everything. Did they listen? Of course not. Why would they believe Paul? He gave them a warning that it would end disastrously, that they would lose their lives, but they ignored it. And see, what happens is from the end of spring, or from like the beginning of autumn until the end of winter, the Mediterranean Sea is dangerous. And that's what they're experiencing. As the ship is leaving, it's getting closer and closer to winter. And so basically hurricanes are kind of getting started all throughout the Mediterranean Sea during this entire time. So Paul tells them, we need to dock in this place. But they're like, no, we're going to go down a little bit farther because it's a better place to dock. I think it was like 40-something miles that they're going to try to travel. And so they ignore him, and they end up going anyway. So it says, but the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner than to Paul. And since Fair Havens was an exposed harbor, this is where they were currently at, a poor place to spend the winter, most of the crew wanted to go to Phoenix, farther up the coast of Crete, and spend the winter there. Phoenix was a good harbor with only a southwest and northwest exposure. So the 2 men that had the most to lose wanted to continue, and so they did. But God sent these men a warning of destruction if they didn't wait out the storm. They didn't, but he knew what was going to happen. God already had a plan. He knew what was going to happen. He knew the detour needed to take place. And so even though it looked bad for them, God used it for his glory because he had a bigger plan in the works. So let me ask you a question. How many times has God told you to do something or not to do something, but you have ignored it? I think all of us have. And I can see by the smirks on some of your faces that you completely understand what I'm talking about. It never ends well. It always ends up getting us in trouble. And here's what I want you to think about that you may have never thought about before. There is a danger in ignoring God when he speaks to us. If we don't do what he leads us to do, we are never going to know how much of an impact that obedience would have had on someone else's life. The reason God calls us to do certain things or tells us not to do certain things is not only just for our benefit, but also to benefit others. And so had these men listened to Paul, the ship would not have been destroyed. If there are things that you know that you're doing that God is telling you not to do, it's for your benefit. Because it not only helps you to grow closer to Him, it could also possibly lead to having conversations with lost people about bringing them to Christ. But we're never going to know how big of an impact that has until we stand before God and maybe He reveals it to us. And so it may seem completely out of your comfort zone for God to tell you to do certain things. Or, it would be something that you wouldn't do without Him literally saying, it's time for you to do this. But you don't know how much of an impact you're going to have on somebody by being obedient, by listening to what God's telling you to do. Because it could lead somebody to Christ, it could encourage other believers, or it could strengthen your own faith. And it could do a lot of other things. So we have to listen to God when He's prompting us. We talk a lot about how God doesn't talk to us or we don't know what God wants us to do. Most of the time it's because we're not listening. It's because we don't want to know. If you're not reading the Bible, then that's one way you're not going to hear God speak, because He gave us literally His word. If we're not praying and taking it seriously, if we're not taking worship seriously, we're not going to hear God speak, because that's typically how He speaks. Sometimes He speaks through other people. Sometimes He speaks through quiet moments. But if we're not listening and trying to be obedient to what God's telling us to do, of course we're never going to hear Him speak, because we're not paying attention. On the flip side, how many times do we as born-again believers feel that God is telling us not to do something, but we do it anyway? So say God's telling you, you don't need to go to that party. You don't need to go to that person's house. You don't need to get in that car. You don't need to go to that website. You don't need to be on that certain sports team. You don't need to take that job. You don't need to date that boy or that girl. You don't need to go to that college. What happens when He tells us there are things that we don't need to do, but we do them anyway? The world is watching us. They're watching our every move. If you proclaim to be a Christian, you immediately have a target on your back. But people look at us, not just my family, but they look at everyone who proclaims to be a Christian to see what they're doing. Is your life reflecting a life that is faithful to Christ? Or are you someone different when you're not here? Or when you're not around me or around your parents? Are you somebody completely different when it's just you and your friends? Because if you are, I promise you're not taking your faith seriously, or you don't have faith to begin with. Because Jesus does not save us to keep sinning and living like the world. He calls us to die to ourselves, and He gives us new life. But if you proclaim to be a Christian and you're just as worldly as everyone else around you, I would beg the question, are you a Christian? You should not be someone here and be someone else whenever no one's around, or whenever your friends are around. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But we've got to keep the focus on God and not on ourselves. We get in bad situations like the captain of the ship. Even though the Holy Spirit is telling us what we're about to do is wrong, we still go through with it. The warning signs are there, but we ignore them because we are focused on ourselves and not focused on God. It is so easy to get distracted. I get distracted countless times, especially on Wednesdays when I'm trying to get everything finished up for Wednesday nights. I get text messages, I get emails, I get phone calls, all these things that just distract me left and right to keep my focus off from what I'm supposed to be doing. You guys spend probably more time on social media than you do on anything else. How many hours a day do you spend scrolling through TikTok or Instagram watching Reels when it's absolutely no benefit to you whatsoever? You may be able to do the gritty, but can you lead someone to Christ? You get my point? It's so easy for us to waste time on things that don't matter. And yet we say, I don't have time to read my Bible. I don't have time to go to church. I don't have time to do this, or I can't do that. It's because we are being distracted and we hear God telling us to do one thing, but we choose to do something else because we passionately want to look and live like the world instead of like Jesus. If the Holy Spirit is telling you to do something or telling you not to do something, be obedient. We are called to be holy. The grass may seem greener sometimes on the other side. It may look like the world is having a whole lot of fun, but I promise you, whenever they stand before God, that grass is going to be set on fire and it's going to burn for eternity. So it may be greener now, but it's going to be on fire whenever we stand before God. I'd rather be on a dirty mound worshiping Christ than living in a grassy hill just to suffer for all eternity. When we are believers, we have got to trust God more than we trust anything, more than we trust ourselves. These men were not willing to listen to God. They were not willing to listen to Paul. They kept moving. They ignored his warning. But God took something disastrous and turned it into something amazing. So disaster comes. Anytime we don't listen to God, disaster is going to come. In verses 13 through 26, we see the second detour. Favorable winds start to blow in, so the sailors think they're going to make it to Phoenix. So everything looks great. From the onset, they're like, man, we got it great. The sun's out. There's no clouds in the sky. The wind is blowing exactly the way we need it to. So we're going to go ahead and get on the ships. We're going to head to Phoenix. As soon as they get in the ship, the weather just basically falls apart. They got baited into it, and then a storm comes. And this was not just a normal storm. This storm that came through had winds possibly of about 150 miles per hour. That's like a Category 4, Category 5 hurricane in the middle of the ocean. They had nowhere to go. They threw their anchors down in the water, and it says that the winds of the storm literally dragged them across the ocean. And I don't know if you've seen an anchor in a while, but the last time I saw one, they were huge. Like huge, bigger than this. And this storm was just dragging this massive ship that had at least 276 people on it around the ocean like it was nothing. Because these men got baited into something, and then the storm came. They thought everything was all right. But this storm brought 150 mile per hour winds or higher. It brought huge waves. It brought rain. It brought lightning, fog. They couldn't see anything. There was a storm. The Bible actually says in verse 20 that there was 3 or 4 days to where they couldn't even see the sun or the stars. That's how bad the storm was. And they were just being tossed around and pushed and pulled wherever the storm wanted to take them. And it says that the next day, everything they could do, they strengthened the ship. So they tried to tie everything down. They got rid of a lot of different stuff to try to lighten the ship. They tried to strengthen the hull, and they attached boats to it to where if they got hit by anything, it wouldn't destroy it. But none of it mattered. Then at the end of verse 20, it says they started to lose hope. Let me tell you what the New American Standard says, because I think this is really important. It says, from then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. Have you ever given up hope? These men were literally stranded in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, surrounded by a Category 5 hurricane, being tossed and fro. Expert sailors who thought they knew everything, thought they could conquer this, get out alive, and they were abandoning hope. They were ready to admit the fact that they were going to die because they were being disobedient. Sometimes we feel like giving up. They tried everything they knew to do, but none of it worked. There are times in life to where we get into a point to where we lose all hope. We try everything we know to do. We try to change ourselves. We try to surround ourselves with different people. We try to stop doing certain things or start doing other things to make ourselves feel better, to change our outlook on life. We trust ourselves. We get into trouble doing things that we know never should have happened in the first place. It may seem okay to begin with. And look, I've been open about my past. When I started doing drugs, I thought that it was okay. It was fun to start with. But as time kept going on, the more and more that I did it, the worse and worse I got. Alcohol is the same way. Nobody sets out to be an alcoholic. You take that first drink, you think everything's okay, it's exciting and everything else. Next thing you know, you're living in a ditch. You've lost your family because you care more about alcohol or that addiction than you care about them. You lose your job, you lose everything. It's not something that just happens in one day. It happens overnight. So when you start dabbling in those types of things, then it quickly gets off the rails. It may seem like it's favorable winds to begin with, but when that storm hits and you've got nowhere to turn, you lose hope. And sometimes you give up. But you know what's awesome about God? God looks at us in those storms, looks at us whenever we have given up hope, whenever there's nowhere else we can turn, when we are literally at rock bottom. And he says, I still love you. God rescued them from this storm, just like he rescues us in the storms and the stupid mistakes that we make. So let me tell you what happens. There's hope in destruction, or hope during destruction. Paul, in Paul fashion, basically started off and he said, look, guys, I told you so. I told you this is exactly what was going to happen. I don't know about you, but like one of my least favorite things to hear is I told you so. Because that means that you were prideful about what you were doing, and they told you from the beginning, this is not a good idea. And then when it goes wrong, they're like, I told you so. Like, if you would have just listened, this wouldn't have happened. I hear it a good bit. But we don't like hearing that. But Paul straight up was like, look, I told you so. I told you this was going to happen. If they would have followed his direction, no one on the ship would die. He offers them hope. He steps in and says, look, an angel from God told me this is exactly what we need to do if you want to save your life. If you want to be saved, this is exactly what you need to do. He said, if you do this, not a single man on the ship will die. He said, but it will cost us the ship. And so he said that Paul has to stand before Caesar. That's what the angel tells him. So he continues and says that for this to happen, they have to crash the ship into a certain island, being Malta. The men listened in the moment, but a few nights later, some were distracted by the surroundings and they tried to escape. How often do we get these spiritual highs to where we're ready to listen to God and run through brick walls, and then a few days later we lose it? We allow the ebb and flow of emotions to dictate our worship. And so instead of truly worshiping God, we just want to feel that energy or whatever you want to call it. But then when things get quiet or when we're in the storm, we don't know where to turn. God moves in the quiet moments more than he does in the loud ones. Whenever you look at the life of Elijah, whenever he's standing in that crevice, in that cave, the storms come by, the wind comes by, the earthquake comes by. God's not in any of those, but then this gentle breeze comes and God speaks to him in that. It's more difficult for us to listen to God whenever things are boring. Whenever it's the mundane moments that, we're not paying attention, we're goofing off with our friends. And we're just so infatuated with everything being easy. But God is speaking to us and he's calling us to be faithful. And yes, he can use the loud moments too, but those loud moments are few and far between. It's in those quiet, simple moments that God is truly speaking to us and telling us what to do. And that's why we have to listen. But he tells them, look, you have to do exactly this. So these men try to escape because the message has been dulled, because they're looking at their surroundings, again, thinking they have no hope. And so they try to get on this boat that's attached to the ship, this lifeboat, and they want to escape. And Paul says, look, no, you can't leave. Everyone has to stay. And what these men ended up doing is they cut the ropes and they allow the lifeboat to just go off and they stay on the ship. And so they listen again to what Paul has to say. Another day passes. They remove the anchors. They loosen the ropes to the rudders. So they have absolutely no control of the ship anymore. They have literally just said, all right, Paul, we're going to do whatever you tell us to do, and this wind is going to take us wherever it needs to take us. And so they pull up the sail, and the wind starts taking them toward the island of Malta. Before they get there, they hit a reef, and it gets stuck. And so the people start panicking. The soldiers are thinking they need to kill the prisoners so that they don't escape. And then again, Paul has to intervene and say, look, don't do it. So Julius steps in, the centurion that we talked about earlier. He says, don't kill these prisoners. Everyone has to be safe. Everyone has to be safe for this to work. And so what they do is they get all the men off the ship while the waves are beating against it, breaking it apart. And the men that can swim, they swim off the coast onto Malta. And the men that can't swim, they're floating on pieces of wood just to get to the shoreline. So this detour led them to the island of Malta. God did a mighty work here. He used the disobedience and distrust of the sailors to rid them of everything that they could trust or use of their own skill and their own knowledge, and put their life in Paul's hands. For us to fully trust God, sometimes he's got to take that ship and crash it into the rocks. And we've got to cut every tie that we have to our former life and jump into the water and trust that God is going to get us to that coast safely. If you hold on to things in your former life, if you were a Christian, you were constantly going to keep going back to them. That's why being a Christian and dating someone who's not is dangerous, because it's going to pull you down. That's why being a Christian and going to parties where there are things that tempt you is dangerous, because you're going to end up falling into that temptation. God's got to take your former life and crash it against those rocks and completely destroy it to give you what you need. God works through devastation sometimes. God works through pain. He works through suffering. But he has to do those things to get our attention. And what he does is he takes that busted ship and gets rid of it and gives us something so much greater. He gives us himself. There's nothing greater than God himself. He calls us to die and be made new in him. What God has for you is greater than anything the world has to offer. Anything that you can achieve on your own. He has something so much greater. He got these men's attention through the storm and through destroying what they valued most. This ship was not cheap. The man that owned the ship was literally on the boat and he was watching it be destroyed. The captain of the ship, the one that's supposed to go down with the ship, was watching it be destroyed, going against everything that he had been taught. He was escaping and going to the island. The sailors lost hope, but Paul stepped in to encourage them and give them a promise that if they were obedient, that will be saved. When you are hanging on by a thread, when you feel like there's absolutely no hope in life, Christ is there. He is there to step in to save you. True hope does not come from within. You can't just feel better about yourself. Christ has to change who you are. Self-esteem is not going to get you where you need to be. It has to be Christ. So let's continue. There are other kind of detours that come in life as well. There are detours that try to distract us from our faith. And so Paul had to deal with these also. So this first detours were one that got them where they needed to be. The second detours were ones that could have easily got Paul off of his mission. So the second thing we need to do is focus on the mission. Chapter 18 goes through all this. Paul knew what his mission was. No matter how many detours he had to take, he was going to get to Rome to stand before Nero, this man he thought was the Antichrist, and he was going to preach the gospel to him. He said, no matter what I do, I'm going to stand before the Caesar. God has told me this is what's going to happen, and I'm going to preach the gospel to him. So they arrive on Malta, and what happens is the people of the island are actually friendly. And so they see these 276 men who have just been shipwrecked, swimming as hard as they can to get to the coastline, and they start a fire to warm them up because, again, it's storming. The wind's blowing, it's cold. These men probably have no energy left whatsoever. And so they start a fire. So Paul goes to pick up some wood, and there's a snake and it just bites him. It's a venomous snake. And the people are shocked. So they say, they think that he's a murderer. They're like, he may have survived the shipwreck, but justice is still served because this man is about to die. So Paul's got this viper just hanging off of his arm and just like whips his arm and the viper flies off somewhere and Paul doesn't die. So it goes from him being a murderer to being a god. The men of Malta begin to think, or the people of Malta begin to think that Paul is a god. And so in this moment, Paul literally could have had them do anything that he possibly wanted them to do. When you think something or someone is a god, you bow to them, you worship them, you're going to do whatever they say to do. And so he could have told them to do anything. But you know what Paul did? He did ministry. Paul did not get distracted. He was not persuaded by popularity or power. Instead, he goes to, like the leader of the people's house. His father has dysentery and is throwing up, is sick and everything else. He lays his hands on him, he prays for him, God heals him. And then he spends 3 months healing the people on this island, proclaiming the gospel. And there were probably people on the island being saved. Paul didn't go anywhere without talking about Jesus. And so tradition teaches that the church or the people at Malta end up giving them everything that they need to continue their journey. And so after 3 months, they leave and they go to Syracuse. And it says Paul is on the island for 3 days and he plants a church. That is a very Paul thing to do. He's on the island for 3 days, shares the gospel, and plants a church. They go to a couple other islands, and then they finally arrive in Rome. After all this time, they finally arrive in Rome. It's very easy for us to be detoured by power or popularity. How many of you would love to have 1 million followers on Instagram or TikTok? You get paid. You'd make money. People would know you. You would walk down the street and people would know who you are. Your name would be like Chicky Nuggy or something. I don't know. But people crave attention. They crave that power. They crave that popularity. They want to be a professional streamer, or they want to be a professional influencer or TikToker or whatever, because they want to feel like they have power, like they have authority. Paul was right in the position to where he had all the power that he could ever want, but instead of bowing down to that, he said, I don't want it. And he does ministry. He becomes a servant yet again and ministers to these people that need Jesus. You guys realize that 2 of the things that the devil tempts us with is power and popularity, right? Amen. The very thing that people of your generation crave so much is the very thing that the devil uses to tempt us every day. We want to feel important. We want to make sure people know us. The greatest way to do that is to be obedient to Christ. And let me tell you this, there are so many people that have stood in the pulpit that have been Christian influencers that sold their soul for fame. Just look over the last couple of years how many people have quote unquote deconstructed their faith. One of my favorite Christian bands of all time is called Hawk Nelson. About 4 or 5 years ago, the lead singer came out as an atheist. He went from singing about God being awesome and being everything that he needs and these, making diamonds out of nothing and doing all these awesome things that God can do to saying, I just don't believe in God anymore. Fame got to his head. People are so quick to give up on Christianity when they hit a detour. They're so quick to give up on Christianity whenever they get famous. Did you guys know that Katy Perry started out as a gospel singer? I think Taylor Swift did too, right? Yeah. They started out singing gospel music. A lot of the people that are doing secular music now started out in the Christian scene. But as soon as they started making money and getting famous, they gave up on it and abandoned Christ. Because they want power and they want popularity. They want whatever will give them an advantage. So let me ask you this. How much is your soul worth? Do you think your soul is as valuable as it is or as it should be, or are you willing to sell it for popularity? Are you willing to sell it for people to think that you're cool? For you to be included with certain groups of people? Because I can tell you this, your selling point is probably a lot cheaper than a lot of other people's. Your soul is the most valuable thing you have. Christ gave his life for it. Don't let it be cheap. Don't let it be useless or worthless or anything else, because Christ said it was extremely important. It was priceless. Do you truly trust God and put him first, or do you worship him out of convenience? When Damar Hamlin got hurt the other day, I saw so many people talking about, we need to pray for him, we need to do this, we need to do that. Some of these very people a few weeks earlier were making fun about thoughts and prayers, making fun of God, making fun of Christians. And yet now, whenever crisis strikes, they think that they can go and pray to this God that they just got done making fun of. It's out of convenience because they want something. I hope those men and women that did that got saved and truly follow Christ. But so many times we see that people are Christians when it's easy. But whenever there's struggles, whenever there's things we have to deal with, they give it up because it's easier to follow the world because they want to fit in. Don't be that person. Your soul is the most valuable thing you have. Treat it that way. Don't give it up for a few minutes of fun or for a stupid mistake or something else. When you are living your day-to-day life, do you understand the value of your soul? Christ died for it. Second, don't be discouraged by delays. Paul finally arrives in Rome. He's ready to go right up to Caesar to share the gospel, to lay his heart out on the line. But he has to wait 2 years. After this almost year of him traveling and being shipwrecked and everything else, he has to wait an additional 2 years before he can stand before Nero to talk to him about the gospel. In this time, he could have been discouraged. He could have lost his enthusiasm. I have been enthusiastic about doing so many things in my life, and within about 2 or 3 weeks, I got bored of it and gave it up. I've had an electric guitar since I was 23 years old. Still don't know how to play it. But I was amazing at Rock Band. 36. 13 years, yeah. So one of my goals this year is to pick it back up and actually try to learn it. But how many times have you been like, Mom, Dad, I really want to do this? And then a couple weeks later, you're bored. You're like, I'll do something else. I think we're all guilty of that, right? So Paul, waiting all of this time, finally gets to where he's going, and God's like, you got to wait 2 more years, buddy. 2 more years. He could have gotten discouraged. He could have given up. He could have just laid there and died. But instead, Paul, being who he is, shares the gospel. Within the first 3 days, he finds out where all the Jews are. Oh, by the way, he's living in house arrest. So he's got his own house, and there's a centurion that's guarding him at all times. So he's not in like the prison, but he is under house arrest. But that goes to show you how much Julius really liked Paul. But he invites the leading Jews in the city to his house, and he shares the gospel with them. And here's what's interesting. The Jews had no idea who Paul was. There were no letters sent by any of the other Jews that he had already ministered to, but they did know about Christianity, and they knew that it was bad. They considered it evil. And so they're like, we don't know who you are, but we've heard about Christianity, but we're going to listen to you anyway. Some of the Jews disagreed with him. Some of the Jews surrendered to Christ. And then he tells the ones that disagreed, he's like, look, God already prophesied this, so I'm just going to go ahead and go to the Gentiles, just like he did everywhere else. And so he starts speaking to the Gentiles. And so for the next 2 years, this is what it says. It says, for the next 2 years, Paul lived in Rome at his own expense. He welcomed all who visited him, boldly proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ. And no one tried to stop him. This is one of the first times in Paul's ministry that he had no one trying to prevent him from sharing the gospel. While he was in house arrest, chained up, people were constantly coming to him, constantly hearing the gospel, constantly trying to figure out eternity, salvation, all of these things. Instead of being discouraged, Paul spent these 2 years working his tail off for Christ at home. He couldn't even go out, and yet he was still doing this because he had people coming to him constantly that were willing to listen. He had no hindrances. In this 2 years, he wrote the book of Ephesians. He wrote the book of Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. 4 of the most influential books in the New Testament. And when you read those books, it's not him complaining about his circumstances. He's praising God. He's teaching the church what it looks like to be a true follower of Christ. Go back and read these books with the understanding that Paul is under house arrest and is about to die, and see if it changes your life a little bit more. Because we understand the context. They're called the prison epistles. And so you see that he's not lost hope, even though he's in chains for the gospel. Those letters that he wrote while in prison are still used to this day to draw us closer to Christ. When he was writing those letters, he was writing them to the church at the time and had no idea the eternal impact it would have on anyone's life. Every person that's heard the gospel, every person that's read the Bible, every person that has submitted to Christ has been influenced by Paul's life. And a lot of that was in that 2 years that he was in prison. The 2 years that he had no freedom. We're able to infer that 2 Timothy 4:16 and 17 talks about what happens when Paul finally gets the opportunity to stand before Nero. And this is what it says. The first time I was brought before the judge, no one came with me. All of the other believers, whenever it was time to face Nero, the Antichrist, all of them abandoned Paul. Sounds familiar? He stood before Nero. He said, may it not be counted against them. So he's like, God, don't count it against these men for being fearful. But the Lord stood with me and gave me strength so that I might preach the good news in its entirety for all the Gentiles to hear. And he rescued me from certain death. When Paul stood before Nero, he finally had the opportunity to preach the gospel to the most powerful man on earth. His greatest enemy, God was extending the opportunity for salvation. God looked down at Nero and opened heaven's doors to give him the opportunity for salvation. This man that murdered Christians, that killed his pregnant wife, that killed his mother, his father, that did all of these atrocious things, God said, hey, I died for him too. I love him too. Here is your opportunity to know me as Lord and Savior. And Paul preaches the gospel to this man, not knowing what's going to happen, but having the hope that Nero would repent and trust Christ. After this, Paul ended up back in prison. He was eventually beheaded. Nero ended up killing him, taking his head. But his mission was not to live a comfortable life. His mission was not to live a long life. His mission was to proclaim the gospel. And he accomplished that. And because of that, each one of you is sitting in here now. All of us are going to encounter detours. Sometimes God sends them to protect us from something worse. In those instances, we need to trust the godly people around us. And we need to be faithful to him. If there's someone that you know that is a godly person, they're telling you not to do something, you need to heed their warning. Because it could be very disastrous if you don't. Some of those detours are to distract us from what our purpose is. In those times, we need to focus on the mission that God has given us and stay the course. You may never see the eternal impact that you have on someone. But everything that you do has an impact on someone around you, on someone's life. If you're sitting in here being a distraction, you're keeping someone else from hearing the gospel. If you're in the classroom being a disruption, you're preventing someone else from learning. If you're going to school every day looking like Jesus, you were opening people's eyes to the fact that maybe Jesus really is who he said he was. And maybe really, really do take our faith seriously. Everything that you do is going to impact someone else. But have the understanding of this. With every detour, we have the opportunity to trust that God knows what he's doing. To hunker down, strengthen our faith, and be able to tell people of the victory that God had through those storms. Could you imagine the stories these men that survived that ship have been telling their families? Or were telling people everywhere they met? We say that the most important thing that's ever happened to us is Christ dying for us and us becoming a believer. Us surrendering our lives to Jesus and having eternal life in a relationship with him, and yet we don't talk about it. Why is that? If it is truly the most important thing that's ever happened to you, we should be talking about it. We should be going out of our way, making our own detours to go and tell people about Jesus. Getting out of our comfort zone. Because Jesus truly is who matters the most.